I really want to give a warm welcome to Sami Ramadani, who is an Iraqi exile, opponent of Saddam Hussein, and has been from the beginning active in the Stop the War and the anti-war movement in this country. He's a lecturer in the UK and writes regularly in The Guardian when they need someone who knows what they're talking about to speak about, to write about Iraq. So a very warm welcome to you, Sami. Our speaker is Judith, many of you will know, eligible socialist worker and a national officer of the Stop the War Coalition. They'll each be speaking for about 15 minutes, and then we'll throw the meeting open for contributions, questions, as much discussion as possible, and then at the end of that, we'll come back for another few minutes just to answer questions and to sum up the discussion and debate. Sami is going to kick off. Over to you, Sami.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction and thank you for inviting me. I'll probably start with a rather pessimistic note, but I think it's important because it sort of underlines what I'll be talking about in terms of what's happening in Iraq and partly in the Middle East in general. And my pessimistic note is that the secular left in the Arab world and the Middle East is not currently capable of leading any of the upheavals and uprisings in the area. And that is the main reason, one of the main reasons, why despite great uprisings in Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, Bahrain, Syria, elsewhere, we see that it is ultimately the counter-revolutionaries, the reactionaries, the NATO revolutionaries, so-called, who have gained momentum. And now we also see the most extreme of the religious organizations, driven by a so-called Wahhabi ideology, taking over very large parts of Syria and Iraq. Now, these are developments that are extremely worrying, but they also raise a number of questions that need to be addressed, and addressed courageously. If the left fails, then we have to say it has failed, and we have to discover why. If the left has been crushed by fascism like it was in Iraq for 35 years under Saddam's regime, then we have to also realize what sort of tasks does the left have in terms of rebuilding itself and spreading its democratic, socialist, secular message. Now, one of the problems, I think, and that includes myself, is that the secular left, including in Iraq, has not only been crushed by fascism and later by the occupation and destruction of Iraq, but what remains of it is isolated from the mass of the people. The mass of the people are much more highly aware and I think sophisticated politically, despite appearances of secular clashes and divisions, than the small groups that do exist in Iraq, and I do support myself. Now, this is a historic problem, I think, a historical problem, which needs to be addressed, but it can only be addressed if we recognize the weakness. I mentioned that in relationship, for example, to Egypt, to Syria, and to Iraq fundamentally. In Egypt, I, like everybody else, I'm sure in this room, rejoiced at the uprising. It made me feel very young again, actually, that great. Both in Tunisia and later in Egypt and Yemen and Bahrain. I felt like a teenager marching in the streets of Baghdad, as I did when I was a teenager. But quickly, religious organizations, both the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafi organizations, took over and succeeded in imposing their program, their agenda on the uprising in Egypt. That doesn't mean there was no great uprising. It doesn't mean that there weren't incredibly brave left and socialist forces who, in fact, if you like, if you take the uprising as the crowning moment of a series of struggles that lasted several decades in Egypt, especially in the decade previous to the uprising, with worker strikes in the steel factories, with worker strikes across Egypt, the left was always there. But come the great uprising, what was exposed was the lack of a nationwide secular organization that could guide and lead this great uprising. Now, one could say that it takes more than one uprising to build a true revolutionary socialist organization. And that is true, but it can only be built and be ready for future uprisings if the assessment is concrete, is not based on wishful thinking, is not based on temporary appearance of a great beginning. This is my pessimistic note. On the other hand, there are these clashes, these conflicts in the area, and the rise and conquest led by the terrorist organizations, and I use the word terrorism obviously deliberately because they do, in their program, in their ideology, advocate the killing of all people who stand in their way, all people, regardless. And they have done it. They have done it in Syria, and they are doing it in Iraq today as well. They are killing, torturing, raping. What you hear in terms of the various reports are nowhere near exaggerated, by the way. Their imposition of their rule is very, very brutal. In Mosul, initially, obviously, they were still taking over the city. They did not pillage and murder in the first few days. But as they consolidated their rule over Iraq's second largest city, you could see now the fingerprints of what they are doing to this great city. My own ancestors actually migrated from Mosul to central Iraq and then to Baghdad, where I was as a child. But Mosul has a very long history. Some of its churches predate Islam, belong to early Christianity. Some of the historical sites around it date back 7,000 to 8,000 years. It's an enormous loss to the people of Iraq, I hope temporary. But it is a warning sign to all democratic secular forces that if you ignore what goes on the ground, if you do not organize, if you do not spread the message properly, if you do not overestimate your own strengths, then one of the outcomes is this. Now, I don't want to be sounding like I'm blaming the left for the rise of neo-fascism in the area, because the direct reason for their rise is the existence of reactionary ruling classes in the area, led by the Saudi ruling class, the Qatari ruling class, and across the Middle East and Arab world. And these ruling classes are closely tied to imperialism and imperialist interests. Imperialism is going through a very aggressive phase because of the deep economic crises that we have all been witnessing, a crisis of capitalism, which I think can only be resolved temporarily by waging wars. Wars have always been an outlet for capitalism in crises. You show me one deep-rooted crisis that was not followed by a degree of warfare cheerled by capitalist balance. The arms manufacturers, the technological vanguards the vanguards of the technological revolutions that we witness. And within the context of the Middle East, obviously the existence of oil and the other riches of the area, the strategic nature of the area, the existence of the most important of allies to imperialism, Israel in the area. These are all factors that make the area prime for imperialist intervention and aggression. The invasion of Iraq, the occupation of Iraq, comes within that context, that this is a highly strategic area. The peoples of the area have a history of revolution and uprising, so there's a political dimension there, that if countries like Iraq, Iran, Syria, Egypt, the major population centers of the Middle East are left to their own devices, then we will certainly have democratic development, genuine democratic development that will threaten imperialist interests in the region. That's why their intervention is part and parcel of their overall strategy to control the region. They faced resistance in Iraq. They faced very determined resistance. And I was one of the supporters of both political resistance in Iraq as well as the armed resistance, which was legitimate in my view, opposing occupation. But even at the height of that, you could see that this resistance will not be able to unite the Iraqi people, because it was mostly spontaneous, and mostly wherever it was organized, it was not led by secular-led forces. Now, in the context of Iraq, this is almost unbelievable, because for decades it was the Communist Party of Iraq that led the masses in Iraq. Rightly, wrongly, we could criticize them on various ideological grounds, and I do, but throughout the 40s, it was founded, the party was founded in the 1930s, 1934, but throughout the 40s, 50s, 60s, they were the unrivaled leaders of the mass movement in Iraq, both in Iraqi Kurdistan and the rest of Iraq. So what happened? That I partly alluded to Saddam's regime and so on, and the occupation later, but that was also the reality that even though the Iraqi people, in their various forms of resistance, were actually defeating the occupation, the secular left was not the one leading the struggle, or having even emerged with any concrete strength to face today the hordes that are coming into Iraq from Syria and elsewhere across the world. All the counter-revolutionary forces are sending their volunteers into Syria and into Iraq. I've been given a warning to conclude, and I'll do so. And I'll do so by saying that in terms of Iraq, the current situation is that we have a sectarian edifice established by the occupation, and without getting rid of that entire state edifice established by the occupation, Iraq will continue on a downslide of sectarianism, of reactionary organizations taking advantage, number one. Number two, we have a Kurdish leadership, which is today the cornerstone of imperialist presence in Iraq. The Kurdish leadership now is fully integrated with what Israel is doing, what the United States is doing in the region. I do not think they will declare a state very soon, because their presence in Baghdad is regarded as very strategic in itself. They will not abandon Baghdad as yet until they see it probably totally destroyed. Thirdly, the former Ba'athist and Saddamist army officers and forces are also involved in the western and northwestern regions of Iraq. They have an alliance with the so-called ISIS, Islamic State forces, and they have an alliance with the Kurdish leadership as well. So you have an extremely complex situation with a sectarian, reactionary state institutions, plus these diverse forces operating, sometimes in alliance, sometimes in conflict, shaping most of the political situation developments in Iran. I think I'll stop here, and thank you for listening.
For coming along to Marxism to do the meeting. You know, we've been in the Stop the War movement for many years together, and also had lots of different political debates and differences, which you've pointed out makes a movement stronger to have that, but it's very good to have you here today. And I think that, as Simon said, it feels like we're back, doesn't it? Iraq is in turmoil, and actually at the same time as we sit here today, Israel is bombarding the people of Gaza. And if you look at what's happening in terms of our leaders, the Western leaders are wanting to say that they have got nothing to do with it, don't they? They just want to say they're not to blame. This is something that's happening over there. And I said on Thursday night at the rally that really the imperialists are shameless, and I think that's absolutely true. You know, Tony Blair in particular, who's sort of reappeared as part of, you know, maybe some sort of reenactment society about war. He says he wants a new war in Iraq. Not content with destroying the country once, he wants to go and do it again. And not only that, he said, but we also should have and should still bomb Syria. And when he made this statement, he said, we have to liberate ourselves from the notion that we have caused this. We haven't, he said. Well, he's right about something. We didn't cause it. He did. Him, Bush, you know, the Western leaders have caused this. And I think that, you know, when you look at the Blair and Bush era, and some of you may be young enough that you weren't walking and marching and protesting against them, but Tony Blair, and this is a Labour leader, remember, a Labour Prime Minister, was so gung-ho for war that he doesn't want the communications between him and his buddy George Bush to even be published, which is one reason why the Chilcot inquiry, years after it stopped having its public hearings, is still not published, and isn't likely to be published this year, because these notes were very much like, I'll do anything for you, George, you know, let's go, let's go. And of course they were going for regime change against Saddam Hussein. It wasn't anything to do with 9/11 or any of the other things. This was something they planned. And I remember when the Tunisian Egyptian revolutions happened, I remember something Sami said to me on a protest. He said, you know, the Iraqis were denied their opportunity to bring down their own dictatorship by their own hand. That's what the invasion did. You know, the idea that they needed the West to go in to bring down Saddam, actually what the West did is create the situation you've got now. And the legacy, you know, they spent, well, there's different figures of how much was spent on the war in Iraq, but America is said to have spent $1.7 trillion. I mean, I can't quite imagine what that is, but let's just, you know, the idea of spending that on devastating a country, you know, infrastructure devastated, 1 million died, people are still not recovering from the impact of the war, even before this latest crisis. But there is something to point out. Some people did very well out of the war, and still are. Some of you might remember the names, because they changed them, because they ended up with such bad reputations. But Halliburton got billions of dollars of contracts where they weren't even bidding against anybody else. This was just handed out to some of their business friends. Sometimes there was more private contractors in Iraq than there were soldiers, because such was the greed, if you like, of trying to make money on the back of other people's suffering. The top 10 contractors in Iraq secured business worth at least $72 billion. And $138 billion of US taxpayer money has gone to government contracts for services just for the private security people, feeding the soldiers. You know, all of that is running a profit for a whole layer of big business. And even things like when they removed the combat troops, you know, often it was basically change your uniform. You know, you were a Marine, now you're working for a private contractor protecting the US Embassy in Baghdad, the biggest US embassy. They were there for the long haul. You know, it said to have up to 5,000 staff in there, though many of them have had to evacuate. But you have a situation where millions of dollars just to protect the US interests in the US Embassy in Baghdad. And these private contractors, just, you know, so nobody's under any illusions, they're not playing some sort of passive role. They actually were involved in some of the worst atrocities against Iraqis in Iraq during the war. So that's a legacy of devastation and enrichment, if you like, of a layer of business in the West. But the other part of the legacy is what Sami has referred to, the whipping up and use, if you like, of sectarian divisions in order to take control of the country. The imperialists, let's make no mistake about it, they paved the way for the current conflict, playing one group off of each other. And, you know, this is what the imperialists do. I mean, in the country I grew up in Northern Ireland, you know, this is what the imperialists do in order to try to control the countries. And I think that when you see that when they disbanded the army of Saddam, and mainly Sunni army, to create the army that they're currently using, mainly Shia, you've got a situation where Sunnis being driven out of areas of Baghdad. You know, the Maliki government has pursued a sectarian agenda, and we have to keep coming back to what Sami said. They are a product of the West. So when the Western rulers say, oh, it's terrible, they're just hypocrites. You know, this is a product of their intervention. This isn't something that they can just denounce and pretend there's nothing to do with him. And, you know, I think discontent with it is an unpopular government. You know, it wasn't just, you know, it is the vacuum, if you like, in terms of political leadership for discontent is really the tragedy. There's in December 2012 a largely peaceful uprising happened, which actually a popular uprising at the time, and it was utterly crushed by the Maliki government. People killed, rounded up, tortured, and that sense of, you know, where then we have an outlet that becomes ISIS. You know, you have a situation where we are told in the papers, you know, that sectarianism is just a natural thing in Iraq. Like people say sectarianism in Northern Ireland is just a natural thing, you know, never the twain shall meet and everything else. Of course, it has a very different history. You know, the largest communist party in the region, Sushi families, so Shia and Sunnis as part of one family. And I think that sense, you know, the idea that another war, another bombing campaign is going to in some way you know, put down, you know, lessen sectarian tensions is a nonsense. It's some of the worst sectarian conflict was at the height of the occupation, where the most US and Western soldiers there, around 2007 when there was over 150,000 troops there. And now you have the possibility of a 2- or 3-way split of Iraq along sectarian lines. But I think it is worth looking at ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, in the context, I understand, you know, this means the Levant, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, not just the Syria that we've known on the maps. Emerging through the Syrian uprising, big backers. It's a very sophisticated outfit, isn't it? I mean, actually it seems that the Western media are shocked that anybody, you know, who doesn't live in America, Britain, uses YouTube and social media to promote its politics, but it does, doesn't it? Very effectively. Now they're now renamed the Islamic State, they've declared a new caliphate, running through the old imperialist borders. And actually the fact of using on YouTube a little thing saying, here's the Sykes-Picot line and we're now going over it, is really mocking the imperialists, isn't it? And that sense of the line drawn by civil servants, French and British civil servants during the First World War, which was a secret, you know, a deal, if you like, to carve up the region. Of course, once again, playing people off of each other in order to say, I'll back you if you do this, and that sense of actually, in the end, all they wanted to do was carve it up. Interestingly, the Russian Revolution, the Bolsheviks exposed the Sykes-Picot deal so that it was open. But, you know, that sense of ISIS trying to express, if you like, the idea that the imperialists are the, you know, they're the ones taking on the imperialists. And I think that, you know, the sense of how quickly ISIS has taken control of Mosul and other cities is quite dramatic. And, you know, in many ways, it seemed that the army melted away, ran away, gave up, no enthusiasm for a fight to defend the government initially. Obviously, there's been a recruitment and there's been other militias raised to take them on. But you are looking at a situation which is unraveling. I mean, even at the top of Iraq, in terms of the government, you know, you haven't actually got a government, or, you know, that sense of it falling apart right at the very top. You're looking at a very, very dangerous situation for ordinary Iraqis, and it has to be laid firmly at the door of the West in terms of responsibility. Because you remember what the imperialists said in America. It was the project of the new American century, wasn't it? This was the idea that they were going to have utter hegemoning over the region, and in their eyes they would have a number of puppets. And this neocon project is an utter tatters. I mean, we have to start with understanding what this crisis means for the ordinary Iraqis, but actually we also have to say that it is a very big blow to America to see the country that it invaded and occupied falling apart in such a dramatic way. And I think that the Americans are in a bit of trouble, really. You know, it's a contradictory thing, isn't it? The Americans, they are the world's biggest superpower, but actually they can't even, you know, have the country that they invaded, you know, be stable. And I think, you know, when you look at it, the revolutions brought down key, you know, allies. You know, they backed Mubarak to the last possible moment, until it was, you know, until they were really clear that he was going to have to go. And then suddenly you have Cameron and at the time Hillary Clinton saying they're all for freedom and democracy, you know, because they suddenly realised that they had to, you know, have a new strategy to deal with this situation in order to try and still have influence in the region. Of course, they're not for freedom and democracy when it comes to Bahrain, when it comes to Saudi Arabia, who are there still allied with those dictators, but a sense of them having to regroup and having to think, how can we best still shape the agenda there in our own imperial interests? And you also think, look at it now as well, we're exposing their weaknesses. They're having to ally with Iran, part of the axis of evil, in order to prop up this rotten sectarian regime in Iraq. It's a sign, isn't it? You know, they wanted to bomb Iran at one time, and they were blocked from doing that. And I think this exposing their weaknesses is quite important. I mean, Paul Bremner in 2003, who basically ran Iraq for some time after the invasion, he said that we were leaving behind a prosperous democratic Iraq at peace with itself. Now, okay, that was in 2003, he had illusions, but even Barack Obama said in 2011, when the final troops were coming out, the combat troops, he said, we're leaving a sovereign, stable and self-reliant Iraq. Well, in their dreams, you know, this is a region actually the US wants to get out of. They want to pivot elsewhere to the Asia Pacific. They didn't want to be drawn into another war, but actually they keep being brought back. Iraq haunts them, you know, and it was a defeat, and yet they constantly have to be kept drawn back in there. And I think that when you look at it, it wasn't just about geopolitics that America was defeated and forced out. You're actually talking about popular resistance and of course we have to put Afghanistan into this as well. In Afghanistan and Iraq kicked them out, but there was also popular resistance to war here, wasn't there? And I think that's something that we have to remember, that we built to stop the war movement here. It didn't manage to stop the invasion of Iraq, but it did stop them doing more, which they wanted to do. Let's make no mistake about it. They would have bombed Iran had they been able to get away with it. They didn't. And actually the recent Syria vote shows that even now, such as there's no appetite for war here, they couldn't go for another war in Syria. And we have to be proud of the role we played. We played as an anti-war movement, as part of the anti-war movement. That means it's impossible for them at the moment to talk about putting troops on the ground, or even for Britain to be involved. I've talked about the US being, you know, an imperialist power that's weakening. It can still be dangerous. There's no question about it. They may be forced to intervene again because they may not want to look like they're weak, and therefore, we have to be ready to protest. We have to be ready to say no, and that means also what's happening with Israel. We've already had some very big protests, and there may be more. We will have to mobilise. You know, Israel is not America's best friend in the region for nothing, and we have to make sure that we're ready to say no to a new war. Because the Tories are saying, no, we're not going to send in ground troops, we're not going to, but then at the same time, they're saying to the US, we'll do anything you want, we'll give you spare parts, we'll let, you know, they would love to be able to get involved and show the US they're behind them once more, but they're not going to be able to. So Blair's blatant warmongering is isolated, but that's, you know, this is the same guy who's offering, you know, economic advice to Abdel Fattah el-Sisi in Egypt, you know, so this is a man who's still got an impact in the region. But you see, I wanted just to end on one final thing about what this new crisis in Iraq is doing in terms of in Britain. Because there's also a new war that they're trying to do to distract from their crimes, and that is the war on Muslims in Britain. I think it's absolutely vital we recognise that what's going on. Where we get on the news every day, look, there's these young people who are going to Iraq, or going to Syria to fight, and they're going to come back and they're going to bomb us, you know, and then it says that, you know, Cameron even told us that ISIS had plans to come to the UK and bomb us. I mean, no evidence at all, he just asserted this. But actually, Tony Blair overtly whipped up Islamophobia in his statement for saying that he wanted to bomb Iraq and Syria, because he said there's a problem with extremism, you know, warped and abusive view of the religion. He said it's a problem here in the region, it's a problem in countries like Pakistan, it's a problem in the Far East. We can see from Nigeria and Boko Haram, it's a problem in African countries, and it's a problem in our own society, as we can see from Birmingham schools. The idea of putting Boko Haram and Birmingham schools in the same sentence, you know, primary school children in Britain are now, he wants us to see them as a terrorist threat. It's utterly despicable, and I think that the idea of whipping this up is something that we've got to utterly reject. If people end up wanting to attack the Western imperialist countries is because of what Western imperialism has done to their countries, or what Western imperialism has done to Muslims around the globe. In Socialist Worker, right back at 2003, we said the US and Britain will not bring democracy to Iraq. They've never brought freedom to people whose countries they've invaded. It's not going to end terrorism. The war will create more of the bloodshed, oppression, desperation and poverty, which drives people to commit terrorist acts. That's what people fight against. The Western wars have made the world a more dangerous place. It has created the problems that we see in Iraq. It is the root of where it comes in terms of what's happened with ISIS. And so therefore, when it comes to blame, when it comes to scapegoating and demonising people, and demonising Muslims, we have got to stand firm. One of the key things that we said at the beginning of the Stop the War movement was actually to be against racism and understanding that Islamophobia could be the result of the war on terror, and I think we have to do that again, because what the government's really doing with all this, constantly demonising, and it comes, in a rise of, racist views about immigrants as well, is they want to distract us from what they're doing, don't they? On what they're doing about austerity, what they're doing, the attacks on working class people, constantly distracted from that. And the tragedy is Labour's offering no opposition on that, on austerity, on war, on racism. That is the absolute tragedy. Shame on them. Because I think we should be saying, if you thought you had the money to bomb Syria, because if you were going to the vote, you clearly had the money to bomb Syria, why not spend it on benefits for people with disabilities? If there is money for the largest warship ever built in Britain, why not spend that money on the NHS? That's what Labour should be saying, but that is what we should be saying. There's always money for war. That tells you the priorities of this system. So while we say today, no to a new war in Iraq, no to the bombing of Gaza, we should also be saying we have to fight for a very different sort of society, where actually austerity, imperialism, war have no place.
First, a comment about something Sami said, and then a question. He said about, the key element was about the weakness of the secular left, which, in the Middle East, in Europe, in America, in Asia, I think more or less everywhere, the left is a lot weaker than it should be, and in difficult conditions to lead mass struggles. But I think in the Middle East, particularly, and as Sami said, there were very strong left movements. What happened to them? Well, the Iraqi Communist Party supported Saddam until he beheaded them. They did the same in Egypt, supporting Nasser until he put them in prison. They supported the repression of the Muslim Brothers. Then the Nasserites themselves, over the decade of the 2000s, some of us here participated in the Cairo Conference, which was revolutionary socialists in Egypt, working with Nasserites and also with Muslim Brotherhood and many people from the union movement, student movement, feminist movement and so on. The Communist Party in Egypt didn't participate because they refused to work with the Muslim Brotherhood. But some of that secular left, including a Nasserite, a distinguished Nasserite who was there in the Cairo Conference, is now was part of the government following the military coup last year and supported the brutal repression of Muslim Brotherhood. So of course I think we want a secular left, but we have to say what went wrong. And I think sometimes there's a problem with obsession with secularism. When there aren't real popular movements inspired by Islam, the left has to work with them, maintaining its independence. And I think a lot of the left in the Middle East is almost as Islamophobic as some of the left in the West. Finally, the question about ISIS. In the anti-war movement in Barcelona, over the last few years there's been a bloc that's rejected any type of support for the Syrian people against the attacks from Assad, saying they're all jihadists, all the opposition are jihadists. And now those same people, it's a Stalinist rump, but they're there, those same people are talking about the wonderful revolution in northwest Iraq, and that they're not at all jihadists. Well, a few people are, but most of them are a popular movement. Yesterday, a comrade from Lebanon, Basim, said that ISIS were paying $400 instead of $200 like I paid before, and that's how they won so many forces. I wonder if you could comment on that.
It's a question for the speakers, really. We've seen a lot of sectarian murders in Iraq, but isn't it the case that once Iraq had been invaded, the invading forces, America, Britain, had to use sectarian death squads in effect to try and fight the armed opposition that built up to them. And it was people like Colonel Steele, the United States, that encouraged sectarian death squads to try and fight back against the resistance. In fact, they unleashed that started the sectarian killings that are now so terrible out there.
I'm not a good speaker, so I'll just start straight away. My first point was about the Kurdish people, and I just wanted to say that it's very disingenuous to blame the Kurdish liberation movement on imperialism alone when the past 100 years they have been trying to fight for freedom, etc. And this is coming from an Iraqi Arab, by the way. And secondly, it's just a few more points raised. The occupation now has left a power vacuum which has open space for Islamic extremists to take over and such. And as Judith, I believe, mentioned before, private contractors like Lockheed Martin and Halliburton and Blackwater are important to mention as they left a cycle of horrific profit for them to benefit from at the expense of Iraqis. And furthermore, it's important to remember that, as the previous gentleman mentioned before about $400, that it is due to poverty that capitalism creates what leaves room for these young men to be recruited into these terrorist groups, because the terrorist groups use the lack of income as an idea to exploit them. And I'd just like to leave on a more positive note, and a really optimistic note. Iraq is a society that predates civilization, and it's one of the first civilizations to be created, Mesopotamia, Babylon, Assyria and such. Iraqis as a people have survived the fall of empires, British colonialism, Ottoman imperialism, dictatorships and fascism, and now it faces its current crisis. And I do believe it's important that we always discuss what's going on in the crisis, but I really would like to urge everyone to remember the beauty of Iraq and the strength of her people. Thank you.
Speaker Sami told about how ISIS was brought down, the other reactionary forces in the Middle East were brought down. But I think there's a few gaps in that analysis. It's not only imperialism, although it's very important to understand that the imperialism created the context and the general contradictions for these things. It has been the contribution of the regimes as well, the regimes and the dictatorships, but also importantly is big sections of the left in the Middle East, as well as the international left, basically dismissed the possibility of an uprising happening in Syria, for example. And that it helped the regime in framing and painting the idea that anyone who's actually opposing the regime in Syria is basically a terrorist organization, armed groups, and dismissing about 2 years or 1 year and a half at least of popular demonstrations and popular communities, all of these things. This is part of the crisis of the left in the Middle East. Not only the absence of mass political parties, because across the globe there is no mass leftist political parties in a considerable matter to actually affect these things. This is a process of building that. Do you build it while being silent over the regime's atrocities, attacking its own people, or do you build it against the regime, and against imperialism, and against the reactionary forces happening in the region? And this is a very important point also when talking about Iraq, as well as talking Syria, about also in Lebanon and different places. It's not only the US that is intervening, but also it generated an arena of competition of regional forces and regional capital between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And this is shaping as well a sectarian discourse which is curating in Shia and Sunni organization funded, one either by Saudi Arabia and the other funded by Iran. A big example of this is Hezbollah's intervention in Syria, which is funded by Iran, but also it's a sectarian intervention in Syria. Although in 2006 it represented a national resistance against Israel, in Syria it's a sectarian force and reactionary force. And we have to make that reality is more complex than simple categorization. A political party such as Hezbollah and other can have multiple. Ending on this, the kind of revolutionary left we need in the Middle East, the revolutionary left that does not stay silent on oppression and exploitation, that actually stands equally against imperialism, against dictatorships, and against the reactionary forces. That's the only way we can build a left, not repeat the mistakes of the nationalist left who stood silent over the atrocities of regimes and supported them under the threat that there might be a terrorist attack happening for the past 40 years and never happened. Thank you.
I'd like to come back to the historical problem that Sami and Ramadani mentioned, which has taken many forms, but I think you can reduce it to a simple one in the end. If you look at the aborted revolution in Iraq in the 1950s, what happened there is that you had a very strong communist party who could have taken power if it had wanted to, but didn't, because it believed in the Stalinist dogma of revolution in stages. So the first stage democracy, second stage socialism, except the second stage was the massacre of all the communists. But I think we've also seen a similar kind of trend in the Socialist Workers Party policy and the Egyptian affiliates, the revolutionary socialists, when they voted for Morsi a few years ago, and then recently in the presidential election they voted for the bourgeois nationalist candidate. And again, what we see there is the lack of a working class perspective, the idea that revolution is just not possible and we have to find an alternative, a shortcut, except there is none. And we've seen something similar again in the Stop the War coalition campaign against the war in 2003, where the idea was to build the biggest mass movement against the war. Except the biggest mass movement meant actually conciliating and aligning with anti-working class forces, even the church. And what we never heard from the establishment back then was any idea that the war was intrinsic to capitalism, but only a revolution could stop it. Now, if you contrast that to what Lenin was doing in the First World War since its 100th anniversary, Lenin never had the ambition of conciliating all the people opposed to the war, because he understood very well that even the bourgeois, the capitalists were against the war, in the last analysis actually turned against the revolutionary aspect. And that is what we saw in the Russian Revolution, and that is what allowed Lenin and the Bolsheviks to make the revolution. They would not compromise, right? They knew that the revolution was the only possibility, there was no alternative, and we're not getting that from the SWP. And we just heard again the traditional reformist catchphrase from Judith, very butter, not bombs. Right? So the idea that under capitalism you could change the policies, you could shift the policies of the capitalists in favor of the working people, and that is not possible. And I'm speaking on behalf of the Spartacist League.
Then young guy at the back, get his hand up, that guy.
The war on terror that started by the American has caused many human rights violations worldwide. The war on Iraq, led by US and UK, has proven that militaries has failed to counter terrorism as they claim that they're going to. The result was actually, as she explained earlier, was the opposite, which has increased terrorism, and what we see in Iraq now is a big part of it actually goes back to the invasion of USA and UK and all the violations that were committed in this context. My question is, the assumption that kind of like accept the human rights violations in the name of counterterrorism has proven failure, especially after what we've seen happened in Iraq. Now the United Nations, for example, considered the human rights violation, especially in the context of counterterrorism, as a major factor that led to increased terrorism, or even can create it, and if it's just extremism, it can take it to the next stage, which is terrorism. My question is regarding Egypt, in the light of what's happening in Iraq. I'm kind of like comparing the Egyptian coup with the invasion of Iraq, that led to all this, even though it was a foreign invasion, but in a sense there is a similarity, because the Egyptian coup, they also use the same methods, the same ways, which is justifying human rights violations in the name of counterterrorism, and how this may affect that, for example, people like the Brotherhood in Egypt or other Islamists that can become Islamic militants, or may join groups like ISIS, for example, or any other groups. Would you please give me your views on that? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to add what Judith and Russell said before about understanding that, of course, imperialism had a role in the situation of Iraq today, but also to add, of course, about Iran and its sectarian policies inside of Iraq and the rest of the Middle East, which is very important to understand why Daesh and other organizations, and now that we have kind of a sectarian uprising, sectarian military uprising in the Sunni areas of Iraq. Why 2 or 3 years ago we had a popular uprising for more than 2 years in Iraq that drew support from different communities and ethnicities, as well from the Kurds and the Shia, and that Maliki was the one to crush it. And it's important to, when we oppose not only Daesh, ISIS, but we have to oppose as well Maliki policies that brought this kind of sectarian uprising. Also say as well that Saddam Hussein and his regime had a role today in what's happening as well, because we cannot just say it's only imperialism. It's also Saddam Hussein who brought policies about primary identities, about gassing the Kurds, discriminating policies against the Kurds, about crushing the Shia uprising in 91. Primary identities were brought back forward by Saddam Hussein, and in no time was he a nationalist or any kind of progressive character. And for me, this is very important to push forward. And this comes back to the Kurdish issue, because actually what Sami Ramadani represents a lot of time is this, the heritage of the old left, nationalist left, that is because today Kurdish is looking for imperialists to have self-determination, because the left nationalists refused to support the self-determination of the Kurdish people for the past decades, refused to condemn the sectarian and discriminating policies, whether in Iraq or in Syria, against the Kurds. And today I asked also Sami Ramadani, when he said ISIS is a terrorist organization because it kills, it rapes, it tortures, I totally agree. But why is the Syrian regime therefore a democratic and progressive regime when it does actually the same thing? And he was silenced for the 3 years massacre in Syria. What does he not talk about the role of the Syrian regime in bringing these jihadists, in freeing? Actually, the head of ISIS was, some of them were in the Syrian prison at the beginning of the uprising. Why don't he talk about the way the Syrian regime didn't repress on the jihadists when he was actually freeing them from prison when they were crushing the Democrats, the progressists in Syria. And their role also in bringing the jihadists in 2003 to bring sectarian strife in Iraq. I asked him, why don't you talk about this? Thank you.
Now, if people were around in the period before 2003, we had a very strong movement, and the movement was this, and it said this, it said, the US is on the front foot, the project for the new American century is driving imperialism to try and grab more and more areas inside the Middle East, to try and consolidate its power in the Middle East, and so on. This was a conscious, driven strategy by the far right, or the neoliberal right inside of the US. And we oppose that war on this basis. We have to say, we have to come back together again. I think there's been lots of disagreements. Some people might know me and Sami disagree very fundamentally over Syria, but over Iraq, there is agreement. The agreement is this, that this time, the Americans are going to be drawn in against their will. I'll tell you why. Because people will talk about the misery of Iraq, the misery of the Iraqi people, absolutely correct. But I'll tell you what, the Iraqi economy is a miracle economy as far as the neoliberals are concerned. Oil production is back to what it was pre-sanctions, so back to the 1980s. The amount of wealth now running through Iraq is almost 5,000 times higher than it was in 2003. There is, I think, something like 15 Iraqis, individuals, own something like, there's a ridiculous like 60-70% of the national wealth. There is huge amounts of investment from Lukoil, the Russians, from the Chinese state oil industry, from the Turkish, from the Koreans, all the big oil fields that have now increased production are now becoming very, very central to, very important to world oil production. That suddenly means the Chinese, the Koreans, the Russians are now looking for the world policeman, the US, to go back and sort out the mess. Because if they don't, there's a chance that oil prices could go up 40%. There's a chance that 10% of Chinese oil, which comes from Iraq, will be under risk. It was huge warnings coming out of Washington that if we don't stabilize Iraq again, then we will have a massive impact on the global economy. So you see the way in which in 2003 they wanted to go into war, now I don't think they want to go. I think there's Iraqi syndrome. I think they're terrified of going back into Iraq, but they're going to have to, because this is what global capitalism needs. It needs them to go back in. So I think what we have to say is this, that we have to, once again, come together, despite our disagreements, to oppose any foreign intervention, specifically Western US intervention inside of Iraq. And I think that's really important that we take this away from here. I think there's another thing we have to say, is that yes, there is very severe sectarianism in Iraq. We all know it comes from imperialism. We all know it comes as a way of divide and rule. But I'll tell you something else. There is something very common between Basra, Sadr city, which are Shia areas, and Mosul and Fallujah, which are Sunni areas. 1 in 3 people in Basra, one of the richest oil production areas in the country, are beggars. It's the same in Fallujah. There is a shared misery amongst the ordinary people that no one can solve apart from themselves. So I'm not going to be pessimistic, I'm going to be very optimistic. I think despite all the difficulties, you feel that drive, you still feel that tension coming from underneath, that it's a deeply unequal society and it's deeply endangered people.
After Phil speaks, I'll be bringing Sami and Judith back in to answer questions and sum up.
Thanks to Sami for a very frank, very realistic assessment. You've had a lot of questions, and I'm going to add a couple more, but I hope they're friendly questions. But I just want, before getting to those, I just want to make the point that, yes, in relation to Kurdish rights, yes, of course, there's a right to national self-determination in Kurdistan. And maybe in other Marxism we'll have a chance to discuss it. But don't underestimate the extent to which the US is pursuing its specific interests in Kurdistan at the moment. And the US is there very fully in an economic and a military capacity. And this complicates the situation of the assertion of Kurdish national rights. Now, 2 questions I want to ask Sami as follows. The first one, can Iraqis unify collectively? I don't necessarily mean on a nationalist basis, on a collective basis. It seems to me that the evidence from Iraqi history is very strongly that they can and have done. The Iraqi revolution in the late 50s, early 60s was arguably one of the great moments of collective struggle of the 20th century. And it cut across all the so-called ethnic and other divides so effectively that when the Ba'ath Party came to power, it had to embed sectarianism. And that when the US and its allies, including its British allies, invaded Iraq in 2003, they had in effect to re-embed sectarianism. What the Coalition Provisional Authority was all about was making sure that in the new state they wished to create, the only means of going about national politics was on a sectarian basis. So the Americans made sure that finance and arms were distributed through sectarian channels. One academic analysis put this very well a few years ago. It said any Iraqi politician who wanted to mobilise a constituency had to be, I quote their assessment, a sectarian entrepreneur. Because that's how you rewarded, under the US system, that's how you rewarded people for their political ambitions. So under these circumstances, Sami, the question of Iraqi collective identity, is there a historic case for its reassertion? Is it a realistic project at the moment? My second question, more tersely, to which there have been several references, how to overcome the failures of the left to which you referred. Because there are ideological differences, and some of them have come out in the questions that have been asked in the last few minutes. But there's a bit more to it than that, it seems to me. Because the great Iraqi revolution in the late 50s and early 60s was a revolution which was led in a very profound sense by the left, by the Iraqi Communist Party, probably the biggest communist party in the global south at that time. But it was a revolution which, as we say in our tradition, was half-made. A half-made revolution, not taken to its conclusion, a very, very dangerous exercise, which was followed by that party reunifying in government with the people who had butchered the movement, the Baathists themselves. So, yes, Simon, I see, thank you very much. How to re-establish a secular left that has itself been so damaged by these problems of history.
Okay. I'm going to ask Sami to come back, and then Judith will follow.
Can I have 1 hour, Chairman, please? Well, some of the questions made me feel as though I was not amongst friends. But thank you, Phil, for rescuing me. I think all the harsh criticism that were directed at me were based on ignorance of where I stand, unfortunately. I start with the Kurdish question because that's close to my heart. I have campaigned for the rights of the Kurdish people since I was 10 years old. And I believed, and I still believe, absolutely in writing, every time I mention the Kurdish question, that the Kurdish people have the right to self-determination, not only in Iraq, but throughout Kurdistan. This I support strongly. I have campaigned in Britain for decades for the rights of the Kurdish people. People used to approach me and say, are you Kurdish? Which part of And I used to tell them, I'm not Kurdish, but I'm a strong supporter of the struggle of the Kurdish people. What I was referring to, not the Kurdish liberation movement, but the leadership of both the Kurdistan Democratic Party and the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, namely Barzani and Albani. There is now no doubt whatsoever that they had established links with the Mossad. I have the documents to prove it. I am a student of the affairs of the Kurdish people as well as the Iraqi people in general. They have, in fact, at the moment, and for the past, I would say about 20 years now, the Kurdish leadership are the most reliable leadership, most reliable allies of US imperialism in Iraq. And they do coordinate. They now have a de facto ceasefire with the ISIS forces. They are harboring Ba'athist officers in Kurdistan. As the Siduri, the deputy of Saddam, did go to Erbil, did meet with the Kurdish leadership. I don't need to go through all this, but I wanted to put something on the record in terms of my own support for the Kurdish people. Now, the other criticism was in relationship to Syria. That, again, is not based on fact. I was one of the very first people to put my name on paper in a statement which you can Google, supporting the uprising of the Syrian people. I did not support it just because it was an uprising, because I know what Baathism is. My first demonstration in Baghdad when I was 10 years old was against the Ba'athists in 1959. And in 1963, I was 14 years old when the fascists took over in Iraq, and we used to live in fear at the knock of the door. I know what fascist dictatorship means. So to say that I am not opposed to dictatorships across the Arab world, including the Syrian dictatorship, is a very hurtful criticism, let's call it. In the mid-1970s, I took part in the occupation here of the Syrian embassy against the Syrian forces' role in Lebanon. I'm very aware of the nature of the Arab reactionary regimes, and in my initial contribution, I did start by saying the main reason for the situation in the area as a whole is the Arab ruling classes, and that includes all of them. So to suggest otherwise is again extremely hurtful. In relationship to Syria again, I supported the uprising, I continue to do so, and I still continue to do so, but I also say that the uprising of the Syrian people was hijacked by imperialism and hijacked by the reactionary forces. This is the general characteristic of what has happened. To deny this is to deny the reality on the ground. if there were revolutionary movements in Syria leading this struggle, and they are the main components of it, I'll be the first to cheer it in the streets of London. But the reality is the reactionary forces, the counter-revolutionary forces, forces of all types, I don't want to go through the entire list, have taken over because they were more ready, more prepared. They have been planning this since 2003 when the United States invaded Iraq. They have the, go and read Pentagon sources and you will see how they switched policy in 2006 in Iraq from simply opposing the Iraqi people in general. They thought we should focus on supporting the so-called extremist Sunni organizations. And what they meant by that were obviously the terrorist organizations. One of the questionnaires, one of the people who raised questions referred to death squads. The United States established and backed death squad organizations. They established 6 secret militias. This is in the Wall Street Journal, by the way. And they have participated in sectarian killings. And since 2005-06, they have started cooperating very closely with the so-called Al-Qaeda organizations across the Middle East, including Syria, including the arms that came through NATO from Turkey. Where do all these arms and funds came from? NATO has taken over from Turkey into Syria, from the fascist forces in Lebanon into Syria. Now these are facts. You don't need to be a supporter of Assad's dictatorship to recognize this. And there are democratic forces in Syria who have pointed this out from day one. Most of them are still in jail in Syria. For decades they have been in jail in Syria. And it's they who raise the alarm. It is they who are still in Syrian prisons who raised the alarm few weeks within the uprising that, listen, supporters of the Syrian people, we want to overthrow Assad's regime, but counter-revolutionary forces are at work and they might take over, and they did take over in the end. Now, unless we face that, we will not be able to organize effectively. Truth is revolutionary always, and this we have to recognize and move forward with. I'm sorry I've taken quite a bit of time because there are a number of very important points raised as well. If you give me 2 more minutes, I'll be really grateful. I didn't want to go into the Iraqi Communist Party and what it did. I was one of its fiercest opponents when it joined the Saddam regime. That's why I couldn't go back to Iraq, by the way, while lots of left-wingers and communists went back to Iraq 1972 onwards. They allied with Saddam. I was one of the people who said, no, this is a fascist regime, we should not touch it. And I continued to become an exile because of that stance, by the way. I disagreed with a lot of friends and comrades over that. Now, in terms of, yeah, this is my final point. Collectivity of the Iraqi people, I think it is possible, although it's going to take a very, very long time. Somebody said Iraq has been around for thousands of years, Mesopotamia has been around and it will continue to be for the next 10,000 years or so. But how long it will take for collectivity to reassert itself, like they did in the 1920 revolution, by the way, as well as the 1958 revolutions, it will take time. It will take a very, very long. It's a protracted struggle, and it relates to the struggle of the peoples throughout the Middle East. Thank you for listening.
Talk about them being a process, don't we? And what has been, you know, the era of the new revolutions that began in Tunisia and then to Egypt and then flowed around. At one time, the Socialist Worker, we thought the dictators were going to be falling virtually every week. But of course, the other revolutions have hit much more, you know, it didn't, you know, 18 days it just took from a barrack to fall, and yet, and you look at some of the other revolts and what's happened, it's a very different situation. I think that within the left in Britain there has been many disagreements. I mean, within some of what I describe as the Stalinist left, in terms of when it comes to Syria, many of them have said, well, Syria is a progressive state. The regime has stood against imperialism. It stood for the Palestinians, and therefore any revolt against us, by definition, is in some way reactionary, backed by the West. Now, this isn't Sami's position, and it hasn't been at all, but the fact is, within the left, we've had those arguments that actually in some way illusions in Assad as being some anti-imperialist that the West has gone out of its way to back the opposition to bring down. And of course, you know, our disagreements with Sami about, you know, which we start with the support for the popular revolt, but then an argument that immediately it became a tool of imperialism, immediately it became hijacked or co-opted, you know, or whatever the word is. And I think that sense of understanding the sense of what's happened to the revolution, because I think that, you know, when we see what Assad, I mean, first of all, obviously the idea that in any way progressive, I mean, I think you've only got to see what Assad's regime in terms of the brutality that it has unleashed on its own citizens in order to hang on to power. You know, anybody with any illusions that this is a progressive regime should have lost them long ago. But I think that it isn't as simple as just to say, you know, the whole revolution's been co-opted by the imperialists. I don't agree with that analysis. And actually, what's interesting today, because Assad looks like, you know, that he has, through sheer force, has managed to crush much of the revolt, is now the West is actually happy to think that perhaps Assad's going to stay and we're going to continue to work with Assad. So the sense, obviously, of the pragmatism, if you like, of the West, it's not about democracy, and nobody in here thinks it is, but that sense of actually really now, it's actually would prefer to work with the devil you know, actually, instead of a dangerous possibility of other forces. And I think this also brings me back to what the opposition is like in Syria, because somebody at the beginning talked about working with progressive Islamist forces or other people. You know, we have to be careful that ISIS, you know, this is a very different, you know, this is not a progressive force. I mean, I talked about them challenging the Sykes-Picot, you know, borders and stuff. That's not to say that it's some great anti-imperialist force that we should be behind. It's a very dangerous organisation. And actually, I think Joseph is right to point out in the Syrian revolution that actually Assad has been prepared to back off from attacking ISIS in order to have ISIS actually crush the other, still the few remnants of democratic forces of other rebel groups to try to break the bit of the opposition that Assad was genuinely worried about. So therefore we have to see that the role that's been played as a tool of, as well, even though ostensibly it is part of the opposition to Assad, actually it's being used in a very different way. So people shouldn't have any illusions in that. But I think that many of the forces actually, you know, when you read some of the accounts of some of the rebel forces in Syria, actually some of them sort of, you know, saying, well, you know, if there really was all the guns and arms that we were supposed to be getting from the imperialists or from whoever, then really we might be in a different position. So I think there is some, you know, there is many differences really about what's going on. I think probably where we can all agree is that actually, you know, the revolution has taken an enormous battering, you know, from the Assad regime, and is struggling for any sort of survival. And I think that when we talk about the process of revolution, this is something that has to unfold over a number of years. But I'll just end on one point, which somebody seemed to criticise the SWP for being part of a Stop the War coalition, along with people who believed in God, who were religious. I mean, I'm sorry, a united front against war. I am not going to say, do you believe in God before you march against the war? Muslims, for the first time I think in any British working class demonstration, you know, there was places for Muslims to go and pray, and I think this is a good and positive thing. It enriched the left, it enriched the anti-war movement, and so therefore I think what was interesting though, at the same time, it was actually an anti-imperialist revolutionary left that shaped the Stop the War movement, which meant that anti-imperialist politics ran right through it. You know, so it actually wasn't dominated by pacifists who were just saying I'm for peace. It was actually about understanding imperialism, and that's the role that revolutionary socialists could play. And I think a theme throughout Marxism has been the danger of there being a gap where there is no effective, independent, revolutionary socialist organisation. This is not just a question that's an abstract thing, it's very concrete, and it's not just an international question. It's a question in Britain too. And that's why, you know, we in the SWP, it's a sort of organisation we're trying to build here. Because actually we discuss what's going on internationally, but what role can we play here is to build independent revolutionary organisation, and that's what we're trying to do with the SWP, but also stop our ruling classes, stop our imperialist powers trying to go and interfere everywhere else. And actually, because when we say it's for self-emancipation, it's not that we think we can go and build a revolution in Syria or Iraq or anywhere else, but we can stop our ruling classes going in and actually creating more bloodshed and conflict, which is what the history